Okay, so when you picture the Maldives, like those stunning turquoise waters, and those overwater bungalows, like it's just a dream destination for so many people, right?
Absolutely, it's paradise.
But there's this fascinating tension there, I think, because this incredibly beautiful nation, it faces like a really serious threat from climate change.
Right.
With those low-lying islands being extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels and coral bleaching, and
Right.
despite that threat, they've set this incredibly ambitious goal,
Mm.
100% net zero energy system by 2030. Like it makes you wonder, how do they even begin to tackle that?
It's a remarkable situation.
Right.
The country that's so deeply at risk from climate change, stepping up with such a bold commitment to transform its energy system. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is the innovative approach they're considering to achieve this.
Yeah, and that brings us to the study that you shared with us, titled Powering an Island Energy System by Offshore Floating Technologies Towards 100% Renewables, A Case for the Maldives.
Yes.
A mouthful. It is. But the title itself gives you a pretty clear idea of where this deep dive is headed.
It does indeed. This study is really the core of our discussion today, as it examines the technical and economic feasibility of the Maldives reaching that 100% renewable energy target by focusing on technologies that can be deployed on the water, offshore floating solutions.
Okay, so when we think about renewable energy, a lot of us picture vast solar farms on land or large wind turbines. But as the study points out, the Maldives has some very specific geographical challenges that make those more traditional methods tricky.
That's a crucial starting point. The Maldives is an archipelago, is nearly 1,200 islands spread out across a significant area of the Indian Ocean. What's really striking is that only about 1.4% of their entire territory is actually land. So when you're talking about deploying large-scale energy projects that require space, they're facing a major constraint.
Right, you can't just build sprawling solar arrays when land is such a precious commodity.
Exactly.
And this study also highlights their current energy situation, which relies heavily on something they don't produce themselves, fossil fuels.
Exactly. This study emphasizes the Maldives' significant dependence on imported fossil fuels, primarily diesel. And this diesel isn't just for generating electricity, it's also the lifeblood of their transportation sector, powering domestic and international marine vessels and even road vehicles back in 2017, which is a key reference here for this study. Fuel imports accounted for around 10% of their total GDP.
Wow.
That's a huge economic factor, and it leaves them very exposed to the ups and downs of global oil prices.
10% of GDP just on fuel imports, that really paints a picture of their vulnerability. And if we look closer at their energy use back in 2017, what exactly was powering the country?
So in 2017, fossil fuels were clearly dominant. Diesel alone made up 39% of the energy used for electricity generation. If you add in the diesel used for domestic marine transport, which is about 25%, international shipping, another 10%, road transport at 23%, you can see just how central it was to their energy system. The study also mentions smaller roles for gasoline, kerosene, mainly for aviation, LPG for cooking, and a tiny fraction from biomass.
So a real reliance on fossil fuels across the board. And what about renewable energy sources back then? Were they making any significant contribution?
They were present, but their contribution was quite small in 2017. The total installed electricity capacity was 266 megawatts.
Okay.
Of that, only 10.8 megawatts peak was from solar photovoltaic panels, which is the maximum power they can produce under ideal conditions, and a mere 0.21 megawatts from wind turbines.
Wow.
The total electricity demand for the entire year was 0.656 terawatt hours, while the energy needed for transportation was much larger at 4.198 terawatt hours.
Wow.
So renewables had a long way to go to become a major player.
Right. Just a tiny fraction of their total energy needs, and all that fossil fuel consumption must have resulted in a significant carbon footprint for such a small nation.
This study reports that the total CO2 emissions for the Maldives in 2017 were 1.82 megatons on a per-person basis. That's about 3.67 tons of CO2 per capita. Now, while that's lower than the average for many developed countries at the time, it's still a significant amount for a nation so directly threatened by the impacts of climate change.
Absolutely. Every bit of emissions reduction counts for them. So facing these unique geographical challenges and this heavy dependence on imported and polluting fossil fuels, what kind of solutions does this study propose? It's all about moving energy production out to sea, right?
Precisely, given the severe limitations on land, this study focuses on the potential of offshore floating technologies. Specifically, it examines offshore floating solar photovoltaics, PV wave tower, and offshore wind as key technologies that can be deployed on the vast ocean space surrounding the islands. This approach effectively bypasses the land constraints they face.
Okay, so instead of traditional solar farms on land, we're talking about solar panels floating on the ocean surface
Yeah.
and harnessing the energy of ocean waves and winds further offshore. It sounds like a really innovative approach, but how does this study actually determine if it's a realistic option?
The researchers conducted a detailed techno-economic analysis for this study. Essentially, they built a computer model of the Maldivian energy system, not just for that 2017 baseline, but also projecting forward to 2030 and 2050. This model then explores how the energy system could function under two different scenarios, primarily focusing on how to fuel the transportation sector, which, as we've discussed, is a major energy consumer.
And what are these two scenarios that this study looks at? Let's get into the specifics.
So the first scenario is called 100 RESI, which stands for 100% renewable energy synthetic import. In this scenario, the Maldives would rely on importing carbon-neutral synthetic e-fuels from the global market to power their transportation needs, especially for ships and airplanes. The second scenario is 100 RDPTL, meaning 100% renewable energy power to liquid. This scenario investigates the possibility of the Maldives establishing their own local facilities to produce these synthetic e-fuels using captured carbon dioxide and renewable electricity. So in simple terms, one option is to buy green fuels from elsewhere, and the other is to make them domestically.
Both of those represent a massive shift away from their current reliance on diesel. Now, let's look ahead to 2030, that ambitious target year for net zero, according to this study. What are the key findings for that time frame under these two different paths?
This study's findings for 2030 are quite optimistic. It concludes that achieving a 100% renewable energy system by 2030 is technically feasible.
Okay.
What's particularly interesting is that it can be done with only a relatively small increase in cost compared to the 2017 energy system.
Just a small cost increase for a complete overhaul of their energy system. That sounds surprisingly encouraging. Can you give us some specific figures on that from the study?
Certainly, the relative cost per unit of final energy in 2017 was calculated by the researchers to be 105.7 euros per megawatt hour.
Okay.
By 2030, under the 100 RESI scenario, the one where they import synthetic fuels, this cost is projected to be 120.3 euros per megawatt hour. For the 100 REPTL scenario, where they produce the fuels locally, it's slightly higher at 132.1 euros per megawatt hour. So while there is a price increase, it's not a huge jump, especially when you consider the massive environmental benefits of moving away from fossil fuels.
Right.
To put it another way, for a complete energy overhaul by 2030, this study suggests it'll only cost them around 14 to 25% extra,
Okay.
compared to sticking with the polluting fossil fuels of 2017.
Yeah.
That seems like a worthwhile investment, considering the alternative.
Okay. A bit more expensive in the short term, but potentially manageable. And according to the study, what kind of renewable energy sources would be the main power generators in this future system by 2030?
Floating offshore solar PV and wave power really emerge as the dominant technologies for electricity generation. In both scenarios outlined in this study, for 2030, offshore wind plays more of a supporting role at this stage.
It's interesting that wave power plays such a significant role. What does this study project for the installed capacities of these technologies by 2030?
So for floating PV, this study projects an installed capacity of 0.670 gigawatts peak in the 100 RESI scenario, and a much larger 2.550 gigawatts peak in the 100 REPTL scenario. That larger figure reflects the increased electricity demand needed to produce the synthetic fuels locally. Wave power is projected at 0.115 gigawatts in the 100 RESI scenario and 0.150 gigawatts in the 100 REPTL scenario. Offshore wind capacity is estimated at 0.090 gigawatts in the 100 REVTL scenario, so quite a bit of solar, a significant contribution from wave power and wind playing a supporting role.
So with that mix of technologies, how does this study envision the actual electricity generation in 2030? What would the breakdown look like?
In 2030, as per this study's modeling, PV becomes the primary source of electricity generation. In both scenarios, wave power also makes a really substantial contribution, often generating more electricity than offshore wind, especially in the 100 REKC scenario.
Oh, interesting.
It's only in the more energy-intensive 100 REPTL scenario that offshore wind's electricity generation becomes more significant than wave powers in 2030. This really highlights the importance of having a diverse renewable energy portfolio, where different technologies can complement each other's strengths.
It certainly does now with such a significant shift towards variable renewable sources like solar and wind. What about the crucial aspect of energy storage? How does this study address that?
Energy storage is absolutely critical for a stable and reliable 100% renewable energy system. And this study emphasizes that for 2030, both scenarios require a significant amount of battery capacity, estimated at 2.7 gigawatt hours.
Right.
They also both need substantial hydrogen storage for longer-term balancing, 31.5 gigawatt hours in the 100 RESI scenario and 20.5 gigawatt hours in the 100 REPTL scenario.
Hydrogen storage. That's an interesting element. So this study is looking beyond just batteries for ensuring grid stability.
Yes, because while batteries are excellent for managing shorter-term fluctuations in supply and demand, hydrogen storage offers a way to store much larger amounts of energy over longer periods. This is crucial for dealing with seasonal variations in renewable energy availability, ensuring a consistent energy supply throughout the year.
And for the 100 RE PTL scenario, the one where they're focused on making their own green fuels, what kind of infrastructure does this study suggest would need to be in place by 2030?
To produce those synthetic e-fuels locally, the 100 RE-PTL scenario in this study envisions establishing significant production capacities by 2030. This includes CO2 direct air capture DSE facilities capable of capturing zero point 0.5 megatons of CO2 per year, along with a fuel synthesis unit with an output of 187 megawatts of fuel. This in turn requires substantial electrolyzer capacity, estimated at 1.08 gigawatts electrical, and the 25 gigawatt hours of hydrogen storage we mentioned earlier. That's a considerable industrial undertaking for a nation of that size, really highlighting their commitment to energy independence in that scenario.
It certainly sounds like it. And the big question, of course, is what happens to those CO2 emissions by 2030 in both of these scenarios outlined in this study?
This study projects a dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions in both the 100 RESI and the 100 REPTL scenarios. CO2 emissions are reduced significantly to just zero point 0.01 megatons by 2030. This remaining small amount is attributed to the existing waste-to-energy facility. So they essentially achieve their net zero goal for the energy system as aimed for. Think about that, going from pumping out 1.82 million tons of CO2 to practically zero in just over a decade. That's not just incremental change, it's a radical transformation driven by this shift.
That's a massive drop from 1.82 megatons down to practically nothing. That's the real win here, isn't it? Now let's fast forward to 2050. What does the study envision for the Maldivian energy system by mid-century under these two pathways?
Looking towards 2050, this study suggests that the cost per unit of final energy can be reduced significantly compared to the 2017 baseline. In both scenarios, the 100 RES scenario becomes particularly attractive with a projected cost of 77.6 euros per megawatt hour, which is almost 27% lower than the 2017 cost. The 100 RE-PTL scenario also sees a cost reduction to 92.6 euros per megawatt hour, about 13% lower than the 2017 level. So not only is it projected to be much greener, but in the long run, it could actually be cheaper than continuing to rely on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That's a powerful argument for making this transition.
Absolutely. And what about the installed capacities of the renewable energy technologies in 2050, according to the study? Do they continue to grow?
Yes. The installed capacities increase further by 2050, and the study's projections floating PD capacity is projected to reach 2.075 gigawatts peak in the 100 RDSI scenario and 4.795 gigawatts peak in the 100 REPTL scenario. Wave power also sees substantial growth, reaching 0.550 gigawatts in 100 RESI and 1.100 gigawatts in 100 REPTL. Interestingly, offshore wind capacity shows more limited growth compared to PV and wave power, reaching 0.106 gigawatts in 100 RESI and 0.426 gigawatts in 100 REPTL. In fact, by 2050, wave power surpasses offshore wind in total installed capacity in both scenarios.
Wave power really seems to be a consistently important growing contributor in this vision presented by the study. And how does that translate into the electricity generation mix in 2050?
The trend continues with electricity generation being dominated by PV and wave power in 2050. According to the study's modeling, both see significant growth in their output. Offshore wind's contribution remains relatively modest in comparison.
And the need for energy storage in 2050, does that also evolve in the scenarios outlined in this study?
Absolutely. Battery storage needs, according to the study, increased to 8.3 gigawatt hours in the 100 RESI scenario, but actually decreased to 3.9 gigawatt hours in the 100 REPTL scenario. By 2050, hydrogen storage requirements also change, increasing to 62.8 gigawatt hours in the 100 RES scenario and a substantial 92 gigawatt hours in the 100 REPTL scenario. These shifts reflect the changing dynamics of electricity supply and demand as the system evolves over time.
That's quite a difference in storage needs between the two scenarios in 2050. What does this study suggest drives that?
It's likely due to the increased reliance on local e-fuel production in the 100 REPTL scenario, which provides more consistent baseload demand for electricity, potentially reducing the need for short-term battery storage. However, the larger hydrogen storage in that scenario suggests a greater need for seasonal balancing of the renewable energy supply to ensure consistent fuel production.
And for the local e-fuel production in the 100 RDPTL scenario in 2050, what kind of scale are we talking about based on this study's projections?
By 2050, this study projects a significant increase in the capacities for local e-fuel production. The CO2 direct air capture capacity would need to grow to zero point 0.9 megatons per year, and the fuel synthesis unit capacity would more than double to 335 megawatts of fuel output. This would also necessitate larger electrolyzer capacity reaching 1.9 gigawatts electrical, and the much larger hydrogen storage capacity of 80 gigawatt hours. So a considerable scaling up of the local green fuel production infrastructure by mid-century really paints a picture of a potentially energy-independent Maldives running entirely on renewables.
Now, you mentioned earlier that wave power seems to play a crucial role according to the study. Can we dig a bit deeper into that? What are the specific advantages it brings to the system?
One of the key findings of this study is the significant cost advantage of including wave power in the energy system. This advantage, according to their analysis, ranges from about 1.8% to as high as 11%, depending on the specific scenario and the year being considered. That's a pretty substantial cost saving. What makes wave power so beneficial in this context, as highlighted by this study, is its superior annual capacity factor compared to some other renewables. Think of capacity factor as a measure of how often a power plant is actually generating electricity compared to its maximum potential. A higher capacity factor means a more consistent power supply. Crucially, wave power also provides more stable electricity generation, particularly during the monsoon season, when solar PV generation might be less reliable. This consistent output makes it an invaluable asset for the Maldivian energy system, as this study emphasizes.
So it fills in the gaps when other renewables might be less available. That makes a lot of sense. And how does incorporating wave power affect the other components of the energy system, according to this study?
This study found that integrating wave energy actually reduces the need for floating PV capacity, as well as the required capacity for battery storage, and quite significantly offshore wind capacity. It seems that wave power's more reliable generation helps to smooth out the overall energy supply. However, the study notes that it might slightly increase the need for hydrogen storage to manage any seasonal variations in wave energy availability. So it's a balancing act. But the overall impact of including wave power seems overwhelmingly positive in terms of cost and stability, according to this research.
So it's a balancing act, but the overall impact of including wave power seems overwhelmingly positive in terms of cost and stability. Now, looking beyond the specific case of the Maldives, what broader implications does this study have for other island nations or coastal regions facing similar challenges?
This study provides a really compelling blueprint for other archipelago countries and low-lying coastal areas that are grappling with limited land availability and the impacts of climate change. The success demonstrated here highlights the potential of offshore floating technologies, particularly the high capacity density of floating PV, to overcome land constraints in many parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
The study itself mentions capacity densities of 100 to 200 megawatts peak per square kilometer for floating PV, which is pretty impressive compared to land-based options.
But what about the environmental considerations of putting all this infrastructure out at sea? Does this study touch on that?
Yes, that's a crucial point, and this study acknowledges the need for these offshore technologies to be designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, which are becoming increasingly frequent and intense due to climate change. This is essential to prevent any harmful impacts on the marine environment, the delicate ecosystems, and of course, human safety. The technology needs to be resilient.
Absolutely. And the potential benefits in terms of energy security must be significant too, right? Reducing that reliance on imported fossil fuels, as this study surely highlights.
Exactly. This study emphasizes that these offshore floating energy technologies have the potential to significantly enhance the Maldives' national energy security by drastically reducing their dependence on imported fossil fuels. This aligns perfectly with the country's own energy policy goals of providing affordable and reliable electricity while increasing energy independence.
And what about the potential socioeconomic impacts? Could a transition like this create new opportunities, as this study might suggest?
The transition to a 100% renewable energy system would undoubtedly have socioeconomic impacts. And this study briefly touches upon the potential for job creation in areas such as installation maintenance and potentially even the manufacturing of these offshore technologies. This could provide a significant boost to the local economy.
That's another important piece of the puzzle. A just transition needs to consider the economic opportunities as well. Finally, for small island developing states like the Maldives, undertaking such a massive energy transformation likely requires significant financial support. Does the study address that crucial aspect?
Yes, this study acknowledges that small island developing states, SIDs, often face challenges due to high public debt and limited financing capacity. Therefore, it emphasizes the critical need for financial support from multilateral development banks, bilateral cooperation with donor countries, private sector investment, and foreign investments to make large-scale renewable energy projects like these a reality. It's a collaborative effort, it seems, to help these vulnerable nations build a more sustainable future.
Well, this deep dive into the study, powering an island energy system by offshore floating technologies towards 100% renewables, a case for the Maldives, has been truly insightful. It really showcases the potential of innovative technologies to address the unique challenges faced by island nations on the front lines of climate change.
Indeed, this study convincingly demonstrates the technical and economic feasibility of the Maldives, achieving a 100% renewable energy transition by 2030, with offshore floating technologies playing a central and vital role.
And it's not just a short-term fix. This study also highlights the significant long-term cost benefits and the dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions projected by 2050, making a powerful case for this ambitious shift.
What's particularly striking is how this research combines various offshore technologies, floating solar PV wave power, and offshore wind, in a comprehensive energy system analysis. As the study itself points out, this holistic approach, considering the interactions and complementarities of these technologies, fills a significant gap in previous research on island energy systems.
Absolutely. It's not just about slapping some solar panels somewhere. It's a carefully considered and integrated approach, as detailed in this study. And considering the Maldives' ambitious goals and their profound vulnerability to climate change, this study, powering an island energy system by offshore floating technologies towards 100% renewables. A case for the Maldives really provides a compelling and hopeful vision for a truly sustainable energy future. It makes you wonder, considering your own context and the environmental responsibilities we all share, what innovative solutions might be required to navigate the complex challenges of energy transition.